My promise to you today is that I can show you how to get yourself to want to study more, even when you're unmotivated. So this is going to be you before, like this. This is going to be you after. Absolute academic weapon of mass destruction. Sound good? Here's what you'll learn. Number 1, the introduction. We just covered that. Number 2, the 3 most common things that students have problems with and my favorite solutions to them. And then number 4, how you can implement them. That's going to be the second portion of this masterclass. So if you stick around to the end, I will show you how you can get yourself to want to study more even when you're unmotivated. Sound good? 3 most common problems that students face. Number 1, lack of motivation. Number 2, procrastination. And number 3, burnout. Let's start with lack of motivation. Everybody knows this feeling. So how do we go from this to this? First, you must define what motivation is. And I define motivation as the lack of and desire to obtain something that you don't have. And when somebody says, give me some motivation, what they really mean is remind me how good the thing I don't have yet is so that I want it more. In other words, you're increasing the lacking experience. So how do you motivate yourself to study? Well, you don't. You might be like, what? Motivation is the perceived lack of. And therefore, if you have a lot of work to do, as in the work is plentiful, then by definition, you can't be motivated to do it. Because you can't be motivated to do work unless you have no work to do. And you might be thinking on a technicality, oh, Simon, like, what about getting work done, right? I don't have any work done. Well, actually, you do have a lot of work done because you had to do a lot of work to get to where you are today. So that also doesn't apply. So what's the solution? Well, you need to draw motivation from somewhere else. Where is this somewhere else? Your end goals, and not from the steps to achieve it. You need to remind yourself why you're doing this. But it goes even further than that, because goals are an external motivator, and there's more than one type of motivation. Let me introduce to you the multidimensional motivation scale. So over here we have amotivation, which is a complete absence of motivation, and then we have extrinsic motivation, which is everything that's outside, it could either be push or pull factors. So anything, if you're a mouse, for instance, say you're a mouse, this could be you are trying to get the cheese, right? Yeah, okay. And then also running from a cat. Those are both external, but they're push and pull factors. And then you have intrinsic motivation, which is essentially you are the only person who is motivating yourself to do it. You are acting because it is simply something that you enjoy doing. So how do you get from amotivation to intrinsic motivation? Well, you have to act like the person who has what you want or who you want to become, and eventually you won't have to pretend. Therefore, the motivation comes from figuring out what you want and then becoming the person who can get it. So now that we've covered motivation, let's go to procrastination. This is one that I know a lot of you want, right? There's 2 reasons why you procrastinate. Number 1, unknown energy cost. In essence, your body doesn't know, or your brain doesn't know, how much energy something is going to take. And if it doesn't know something, it reverts to protecting the body. And so it won't give you that energy. Number 2 is a lack of perceived importance. Lack of perceived importance, we've all felt this. Things don't matter until you're close to the deadline. So let's cover both. Number 1, unknown energy cost. How can we solve this? 3 ways. 1, you can read all the instructions, right? A lot of us don't even look at the instructions until it's a couple days before the deadline. Number 2, Swallow the Larger Frog by Mark Twain. And number 3, put it in the blender. It's something I added after Mark Twain's. So let's start with read the instructions. For a single task, read the instructions. For multiple tasks, read all the instructions. Yeah, because then you need to do another crucial step, which is to rank things by difficulty. So how do we know what difficulty is? Well, difficulty is the complexity times the duration. And after reading all the instructions, you're going to use this next step in swallowing the frog. Well, what does swallowing the frog mean? Well, obviously we don't want to swallow this frog because it's way too cute, right? But it basically means you tackle the hardest problem first. And so how do you know which one to do? Because there's so many. And it could be time, how much time it's going to take. It could be how much effort it's going to take within that time, you don't really know. So what do? Well, you just did it, right? You have the difficulty, and that is the complexity times the duration. And so all you have to do is just go down the list of everything that you ranked. And why do we do the hardest task first? This is really what we're trying to ask ourselves here, is like, why does this even matter? Well, number one, there's something that I call de-snowballing. And number two, avoid task completion rationalization, which is something that a lot of us do. And I'm going to get into both of these in a bunch of detail right now. So let's start with de-snowballing. First of all, what is de-snowballing? Well, if you think about a snowball, it goes from being small to being big when you push it, right? But this line here represents how hard something is because you spent so much time doing it already. And so if you start with the small tasks, you go to the big tasks, well, you're doing the larger tasks when you have less energy because you've already used some. And so de-snowballing is starting with the harder task and going to the smaller one. You can see it'd be much easier to push this smaller snowball up the hill if you've shed some of that snow off, over time, because you're starting with the hardest thing. So you're starting with the large snowball. When you have the most energy, it's easiest to push, and then it kind of tapers off. So that's de-snowballing. Next, avoid task completion rationalization. How do we do this? Well, remember the snowballing scenario. Now we have de-snowballing. This is what it looks like, right? And so in the snowballing scenario, there's something that I call the snow wall. See what I did there? Snowball, snowball. All right, anyway. So on the left of this wall, we have tasks completed, and on the right, we have tasks to do. Now, this is something I need you to pay attention to because it's very important. This is the rationalized work region, where all of us think that we've done a lot of tasks, right? You've done many little tasks. But what happens is that when you get past this zone, right, once you've done all of this, it seems like you have very few tasks left, except you're left with very little cognitive energy and the very hard tasks. So while it might seem like you completed most of the things on your to-do list, the reality is, right, and a lot of us do this, is that we're left with the things that really mattered, that we really should have done. And we just wanted to feel productive, so we did the small things anyway. So that's task completion rationalization. So now we've covered read all the instructions, swallow the frog, let's put it in the blender. I know that was a lot, so just so you remember where we are, unknown energy, right? That's part of procrastination. So put a frog in a blender? No, of course not. This frog is way too cute. You can't do that, right? But hypothetically speaking, if you were to blend up a frog, it would be easier to swallow. You could probably drink it with your nose pinched, right? So if the frog is an essay and it's blended up, let's break it down into the small tasks just like we would for an assignment. So we have walk to your computer, open and turn on your computer, read the assignment instructions, pick a topic, pick a title, write the name, date, and student number, write an outline, find the applicable sources, and write the intro. These are all very small tasks that you could do pretty easily if you're just, breaking it down. There's not a lot of, activation energy to overcome because they're so small. You can just think, oh, well, I could knock that out in like 2 or 3 minutes tops. Easy, boom, done. So how does blending up the task help? Well, it decreases the activation energy like we just said. It also leverages inertia. That is the feeling of keeping the ball rolling, right? You have that progress. You want to maintain the progress, the momentum. And then it also coaxes out productivity. And this is what I want to get into a little bit more. So focus is seduction. It is not abuse. And a lot of us crack the whip down on ourselves. But what happens if you beat yourself up for not focusing? Well, your brain is really good at making associations, and it will train your brain to avoid work altogether. Because if the association is work plus focus, and that's a neutral outcome because most of us don't reward ourselves, and then you have work without focus, that leads to a punishment because you hate yourself now. You don't like that you didn't do work. Well, what happens? If you avoid work plus focus, it's still neutral, but if you avoid work without focus, it's negative reinforcement because you're removing a punishment. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that the conclusion of this is that if you avoid work, which was the only common factor between the two, right? One with focus, one without, now you're avoiding a potential punishment because your brain doesn't know which one is going to happen. So if you sit down to work, it just knows, oh, work, there might be a punishment. I don't know. And if you think about reinforcement schedules, right? The variable reinforcement, similar to a casino when you don't know if you're going to win, right? The same goes for if you don't know if you're going to be punished or not, it leads to learned helplessness, and then you don't want to do the task at all. And so you're literally training yourself to avoid doing work. That's not good. So we need to coax productivity out of ourselves, put it in the blender. So now that we've covered the unknown energy cost, let's go to the lack of perceived importance. This solution is incredibly simple. To increase the perceived importance, all you need to do is assign each part of your blended frog its own deadlines. And what will happen is that you'll end up going from this, which is where your importance goes up over time until you're just barely above this line where you can start working on it because it's actually important enough. Usually that's right before the deadline. This would be like the cram zone. Well, what happens if you break it up and you assign those arbitrary deadlines? Well, now you're left with this. And you spent a lot of time above this line here, right? You're going to get way more done because it's going to be way more important more times. So that's lack of perceived importance. That's how you're going to do it. Just assign arbitrary deadlines to the blended up frog. Now, let's go into burnout. This is my favorite one because many of us have been told that you need to study hard to get good grades. Well, there is some truth to that, but a lot of us assume that hard means more hours spent studying, more hours cracking down the whip. And the reality is this is not true. Studying harder can mean studying more intensely, can be studying more effectively. It doesn't necessarily mean you study for longer. Here's my burnout equation. And I'll present this to you like math. Burnout equals the perceived effort times the hours worked divided by the results minus 1. Well, why minus 1? Well, because you need it to be able to go negative because there's a point where you've done so much work that you can just chill and not get any stress for a long time. Think of it like putting money in a bank. And here's the second part of the equation, which is productivity equals work intensity over hours worked. We're not going to get too into that, but we can get into the other ones. So burnout, how do we decrease it? We can decrease perceived effort or decrease the number of hours worked, or you can increase the results that you get. So how do you decrease the number of hours spent or the effort that you've perceived to put in? Well, there are 3 ways to do this also. Number 1, avoid the gray zone. And this is the gray zone of socializing and working at the same time. And then you can add contrast to your breaks. What does this mean? Well, you want to add contrast to your breaks because you need a stimulus to let your body and brain know that you're no longer supposed to be working, to shut down that sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight, the cognitive arousal, the cortisol response, the stress responses. You need to shut that down, stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. That's when you go home, when you get tired, it's usually because you know home is safe and so you can kind of decompress, right? So you want to make sure that you have contrast. If you just keep sitting at your desk, you're going to be still very cognitively aroused. You're going to be very stressed out because you're doing work, and so the rest doesn't really do anything. The rest is supposed to down-regulate your stress response to allow you to decrease the cortisol, because what happens if there's too much cortisol? I'm going to get a little scientific here. You don't necessarily need to know this, but just understand what I'm trying to explain. When cortisol stays too high, it interrupts the ability for the prefrontal cortex to allow for learning. But essentially it disrupts BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which allows for neuroplasticity. And essentially if you have too much cortisol, then there's not enough of that. It's basically all you need to know. So you need to add contrast to your breaks. And number 3, you need to change locations between work sessions. Why do this? Well, your brain is very good at tracking how much effort that you've given. And so the way it tracks this is 1, by the task you're doing, but if you complete a task, then it can just move on to the next one. But it also tracks it by location, how long you've spent somewhere. If you spent too much time somewhere, it gets comfortable. It stops giving you energy to use because it assumes that you're safe, right? And that's good if you want to down-regulate and you want to decompress, but it's not good if you want to boost more energy out of yourself, right? And so changing locations allows you to experience a new environment. Your body and your brain need to take in more information, and therefore the sympathetic nervous system needs to be upregulated, and you're given more energy to do your work. So that's changing locations. So now we know how to decrease the hours and the effort. Now let's talk about increasing the results. How do we increase the results? Well, this one's actually very simple. I'm going to blow your minds right now. So it simply comes down to how effectively you study. That's it, right? Results, just how much you get out of what you're doing. So it's how effective you are. And I'm not going to cover this completely in depth, all these study methods, because it's just a lot to get into and I don't really have time, but I will share a few of my favorite methods. And if you want more explanations on this, and you want to know how I got A's in less than 2 hours a day, because I used to spend 8 hours a day studying and I got terrible grades. Now I get A's studying only 2 hours a day in much harder classes. You can go to UofTearless.com. I cover it all in the video series called the 2-Hour Method. So how exactly do I know if a study method is efficient? Well, here's how I know. I ask myself a very simple question. What would I do if I only had one method to use to prepare for an exam? Would I be prepared? So let's go through a couple examples. Number one, if you only used notes, would you be prepared for an exam? Probably not. What if you only rewatched lectures? Again, probably not. So what are my favorite efficient study methods? Well, here are some popular ones. I really like spaced repetition flashcards. This is probably 80% of what I do, but the other 20% is self-generated practice questions, full-length practice questions, right? For self-generated, by the way, this is, you get another boost of memory called the self-generation effect, where your brain remembers more because you generated the content. And so reading other people's notes is actually really disadvantageous for you because you don't get the self-generation effect. So self-generation effect, practice questions, it could also apply to practice exams, although sometimes you're given practice exams, but if you're not, you can make your own. Blurting method. This is essentially when you talk to anything, the wall, your friend, your stuffed animal, and you just understand where in the explanation process you don't understand what's going on, because articulating your thoughts is another thing altogether than just learning it the first time, right? You can know something really well, you can have a really good cognitive framework, but if you can't, so that's encoding, that's the encoding process from converting information into something that's storable, but then to get it back out, that's retrieval. And that's a whole nother process, and you need to practice that, because if you can't get what you know onto the page, then the professor's not gonna know that you know it. And that's really bad. So, blurting method, really, really good for exam prep. And then finally, mind mapping, which is one that I actually don't use too often, but if there are a lot of concepts that I need to know how they figure out, like maybe pathways of certain biological mechanisms, I might use it for that just to know how they interconnect. But I also like a few unpopular ones. Number one, mental priming. Everybody knows what this is, except nobody actually uses it because nobody wants to do work before the lecture starts. But if you review the lecture and you do it in conjunction with speed reading, right? Then you can go through the lecture really fast. You can pull out all of the really important information really fast, everything that jumps out at you. You know the bullet terms, you know the main topics. You don't need to know the details right now, right? Because the professor is going to fill those in, but you need to have the foundation, the groundwork to put in all that information and know where it fits. And it will help you understand so much better when you go to lecture. I promise you, it will make a world of difference. So, speed reading and mental priming, those kind of go hand in hand. And then we have semantic visualization, which is essentially when you take the meaning of words and you create an image because your brain is much better at remembering images rather than words. If I were to say the word spoon, right? You don't think of S-P-O-O-N, you think of a spoon because you know what it looks like, you know what it is, right? And so there was one time that I actually used this in London when I was trying to remember the order of the train stops on a certain line, and I just made up a story, a visualization, like kind of a movie of like, okay, there was a king, and a queen on the road, some road, it's like Patrick Road or something like that. And they were having dinner and there was an insect that came down or something, I don't know. It was a very like vivid thing. I was like, wow, that's not something that I would ever experience in real life. So it was very shocking. It was very salient. It grabbed my attention and helped me remember the order of things. Another example, think of the mitochondria. We all know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. If you think of it like it's the engine to a car, now you can think of a car crash. The engine exploded, right? There's fire everywhere. You smell gasoline, you smell burning wreckage. You can hear the crackling of the fire, right? You heard the explosion. You can taste the smoke. It's a lot of senses that you're including, and the more sensory detail you can get, the more ways this information is encoded. So semantic visualing goes further than just visual processing. You can also include all the other senses. And then fourth, we have Simon's 3x3 technique, my personal favorite. What is the 3x3 technique? Well, it doesn't exist, so I'm gonna have to explain it to you. Basically, I have something called the 3 threes, which is my definition for knowing when you cannot get something wrong. You know it so well that you can't just get it right, but you cannot get it wrong. How do the 3 threes play into this? Well, I define it as you need to get something right 3 times in a row, for 3 days in a row, and then after that, you can do it once every 3rd day until the exam. And I promise you, you will never forget it because you will be overlearning, and overlearning makes something incredibly difficult to forget no matter how much time has passed. It's so deeply ingrained, you've encoded it in so many different ways, it's interacting with so many different engrams, which is basically, if you think of like an iPad and then you're writing on an iPad, right? The iPad would be the engram and what you're writing on is the information. So it's basically forming a memory in space. It's like an engram is essentially a group of neurons that hold a specific memory. So there's a bunch of different engrams that interconnect with each other, right? This is hippocampal indexing theory or multiple trace theory. And yeah, they just interact and makes it incredibly difficult to forget. And if you sustain brain damage, it's gonna be still very hard to forget. You can recover because you have so many interlocking neural pathways. So brain damage, by the way, could just also be fatigue, right? Just not good enough sleep, too many things to memorize, you're just really tired one day, or you're just not, you ate too many carbs before an exam, right? So if you want more details on that, you can just go to UofTearless.com again. And now my question to you is this. What type of study vehicle are you driving right now? Is it a Honda Civic or a spaceship? And I want you to be honest with yourself. Because is there a better way? And if there is a better way, why haven't I looked for it and why haven't I implemented it? 2 years ago, I asked myself these very same questions. I had a really hard time in school in first year. I went from the top of my class in high school to a 37% in my first semester. Awful drop in grades. And I was like, I am not cut out for this. What do I do? Why is my learning so slow? And I realized that I was driving a snail. And let me know if this sounds familiar. In first year, this was the way that I studied. Rereading textbook chapters and lecture slides, rewriting my notes, rewatching YouTube videos, and reading my friends' notes. I'm sure a lot of us do this. And you might feel like I'm calling you out right now, and I am, but only because I used to do it too. So I know what it was like, and it sucks. Because you feel like you're doing a lot and it really isn't doing that much. Why? Because these are incredibly passive ways of learning. There's no self-generation effect. You're not doing anything with the information after you've done it, and you're literally just rereading something, which is basically just rereading the textbook chapters, but just with less detail. So you need to actually do something with the information, and all of this just prepares you to know what to learn. But it's not the learning itself. It just exposes you. It's essentially all of this is mental priming. You're not even in lecture yet. You're not even studying after lecture yet. You don't actually encode much of this. And that's why in the burnout equation, you put in so many hours because you're doing something that doesn't make a difference, and doing more of something that doesn't make a difference is not going to make a difference. Another question you can ask yourself is, does the difference make a difference? If the difference does make a difference, then you know that it's effective. It was a good change. So Simon's learning speed back then was a snail. So what's the lesson that I learned from this? Don't do this. Do a lot of this. That covers increasing results. So now that we've covered burnout, we go back to our original agenda. We've covered the 3 most common student problems. We're going to go through this really quick and do a quick summary. We've covered the 3 most common problems, which were motivation, procrastination, and burnout. We've covered my favorite solutions to them. So for motivation, that would be figuring out what you want and becoming the person who can get it. For procrastination, that would be unknown energy cost is the problem, and the lack of perceived importance is the problem. For unknown energy cost, the solution is to read all the instructions, swallow the frog, and put it in the blender. And for perceived importance, it's to make your studying look like this and assign arbitrary deadlines to the different components of your assignment. And burnout. How do we decrease burnout? Well, remember, we can decrease the perceived effort and the number of hours worked, or we can increase the results by studying more efficiently. So that concludes my portion of this event. If you have any more questions, you can ask them in the chat and I will go ahead and answer them right now. If you're watching the live stream of this, or if you're watching the recording, you can just comment below and I will get back to you as soon as possible. So now we go into the fourth part, which is how you can implement all of these strategies to avoid burnout and to actually help you today in the real world with your actual schedule, what to do when, how to put it together to make it a final finished product. And that is Jad's part. So I'm going to leave it to him and I will see you after this event for a quick Q&A. Thank you.